Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I've decided to have yet another look at some video game history, and in the process answer the question, what exactly made Donkey Kong Country great? First released all the way back in 1994 as a reboot of the even then venerable and beloved Donkey Kong franchise, and spawning numerous sequels in its own right, Donkey Kong Country is one of the most important games to have come out for the Super Nintendo. But to understand why this is the case, we have to look at what exactly made this game great. And to get started with perhaps the most obvious element, the first thing that made the game great was the graphics. Now for those who don't know, Donkey Kong Country was an absolute pioneer when it came to the use of pre-rendered 3D graphics. Granted, it wasn't the first game to ever utilize them, however, earlier attempts, at least up to that point, had been on computer games and not on home console, with those exact games in question being titles like Stardust, which were on the more basic side as far as gameplay was concerned. By contrast, Donkey Kong was of course a proper AAA title, being released on the Super Nintendo, which was the most popular console on the 4th generation. It's also worth noting that this particular technique also granted far smoother animations than what was typical of console games at that time, meaning that the gameplay of Donkey Kong Country was actively more gorgeous than still images would suggest. All of this helped make the game become so popular that it actively became one of the big reasons that the Super Nintendo remained relevant in the final years of its life, at a time when it was competing with the significantly more technologically advanced PS1. Some critics have even outright stated that Donkey Kong Country was the game that saved the SNES. And while that statement itself is debatable, what isn't debatable is the fact that in terms of sales, starting from the year that the PS1 was first released in 1994, the Super Nintendo still managed to have more sales in 1994 and 1995 combined than the PS1 did in that same time period. So that is the first thing that made the game great. But the second thing that made the game great would have to be the gameplay, and more specifically with regards to level design. Rare proved to be quite capable in making the levels themselves feel unique and stand out from one another. And while they wouldn't fully hit their stride until the next game, it is still safe to say that Donkey Kong Country still proved that they were more than capable of making a game where the gameplay continued to feel fresh from level to level. There are very few, if any, levels in Donkey Kong Country that actually feel like filler, an impressive feat that even some of the most popular side-scrolling platformers of all time have been known to struggle with on occasion. With that covered, let's move on to another thing that helped make Donkey Kong Country great, the soundtrack. It's worth noting that Donkey Kong Country took a rather unique approach to its music, especially when talking about side-scrolling platformers at that time. This is because the game's soundtrack is far more ambient focused than a lot of other side-scrollers. Though I do need to stress that there was still in fact actual music to Donkey Kong Country, and not only that, but the songs that were in-game managed to be absolute bangers as well, with Aquatic Ambience, for example, going down in history as one of the best pieces of music ever put into a video game, period. A tune that absolutely oozes mid-90s nostalgia. But the main point I'm making here isn't that Donkey Kong Country merely had fantastic music. It's that this fantastic music was unlike anything you ever heard from a platformer up to that point, and was music that Rare expertly used to set a mood for their various levels. So I believe that covers most of what needs to be said when it comes to what exactly made Donkey Kong Country great. But there is one final thing I do need to bring up as well, that being the impact that Donkey Kong Country had on the lore of the Donkey Kong franchise. Simply put, this game is single-handedly responsible for most of the things that we know when it comes to Donkey Kong lore. The overall setting, the enemies, the strengths and weaknesses of Donkey Kong as well as of course Diddy Kong, as well as of course their own personalities. This was the game that proved that Donkey Kong didn't have to be tied to Mario in order to be financially successful, that the character could absolutely do his own thing and do it quite well. In a lot of ways, much of the Donkey Kong franchise owes as much, if not more, to Donkey Kong Country than even to the original Donkey Kong all the way from 1981. Considering that this is one of the most important video game franchises in history, it really goes to show just how special the original Donkey Kong Country was. With all of that said, this has been Ace, and I hope you'll agree when I say that Donkey Kong Country is great.